Oh, wow. Okay. So it was wintergreen in 2004.
Yep.
And so either that bus stop scene, either I have the wrong gestalt because I was actually 3 years older than I thought I was, which, yeah, I guess could still check out. I just look
Well,
like such a, teenager in
we're
that
live,
picture.
so don't say anything you don't want to be
Oh, no.
live.
All
Here we
right. I
go.
mean, the photo's out there. There's no
No radical
hiding from it.
fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Monday, January 12th, 2026. I think I got the year right.
That's it.
Second show today. And I'm excited to have Gena with me. Gena Gorlin is joining us and, of course, available to take your questions. As you know, I think Gena is a clinical associate professor of psychology at UT, University of Texas, Austin,
Yeah.
and a licensed therapist. She's a founder, entrepreneur, coach. She works with leading innovators in Silicon Valley and globally. And excitingly, and what we're going to be talking about, she is in the final stages of finishing up a book. No, it's final compared to how much you've already done. Final stages of completing her first book, which will be published by Penguin Random House, so a big mainstream publisher. Welcome, Gena.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
So tell us about the book. This is exciting.
Yes. So the book organically emerged out of my Substack as I was angling for it to do at some point. That's kind of why I started Substack, originally building the builders. Then I rebranded it The Psychology of Ambition, partly in anticipation of the book. But it's really a summation of everything that I've learned, frameworks, tools that I've developed to date for addressing the needs, the what I see as underserved psychological needs of ultra ambitious people who are building new things. So whether that's, literal like entrepreneurs, founders, company, leaders, or really anybody who's trying to live a really purposeful, productive life and drink it to the lees. Because fundamentally see ambition as something that we all ought to strive for.
So is it focused on helping people become ambitious, or is it about people who are ambitious,
Good question.
aligning their psychology with that ambition?
That's a really good question. I would say, at least kind of on a first gloss, it's more the latter. I think this book will appeal to people to the degree that they already identify with the idea of ambitiousness, or the idea of, like aiming high, of trying to do big things or trying to make their life count. So they would already identify as ambitious. But part of the thesis of the book is that ambition is not the default, and that there are lots of counterfeits for ambition that we really easily fall prey to, even when we start with that genuine idealistic urge, that the kind of genuine, the spirit of youth, as Rand wrote about it, that then easily gets co-opted by kind of secondhanded, status ladder climbing, or by virtue signaling, or by following some existing template for a good life, or for success that isn't actually tailored to our fully lived life. And so, in fact, the book is also a primer for becoming genuinely, authentically ambitious, and more
In a sense,
fundamentally
it's
ambitious.
getting you on the right track once you've deviated.
Yes, in large part, but also teaching you how to build a track.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no track already laid out, right? And
Yeah.
that's a big part of the building process of, in building our life. We also build a conception of how we want our life to go, and we also build, a particular, we build a career, we build relationships, we build the integration of all of those things in the particular ways that we want them to feed off of each other. So all of it has to be built, which is a big part of the book's theme.
It seems like the people you work with primarily already people who are ambitious. They're in Silicon Valley or wherever, and they're starting out in companies, so they're already in that process. So what do they need at that point? What is it that they come to you for, or that you're providing them?
Whole lot. I was not to say I'm providing. I mean, I hope I'm providing a whole lot.
Yeah.
To your earlier question, they need a whole lot, and I hope at least I scrape the surface in terms of trying to fulfill those needs. So, I mean, this is kind of one of the big surprises. Whenever people ask me, like, what are the biggest learnings or the biggest surprises for me from these 6-ish years of working almost exclusively with entrepreneurs, with founders, and one of my biggest surprises has been just the extent to which they don't have their act together, the extent to which their skill sets, their talents, their psychology is spiky, to such a degree that if you saw them in the context of like how they talk to their, wife or girlfriend or partner, or in the context of how they prepare their meals, you would think like this person couldn't lift a finger to make a penny for the life of them, but they're building multi-billion-dollar companies, and somehow they have been able to marshal their strengths and to find compensation for their deficits in such a way as to still do something really amazing and for real, not just going through the motions. Like they actually had a really breakthrough insight. They actually penetrated into an industry and saw what nobody else saw, or they really kind of like they built the kind of network of great people that they were then able to somehow leverage. So that's one of the big surprises. But in terms of what they need, there are trends by stage of entrepreneurial journey. And so early on in the journey, they need resilience in the face of massive stress and uncertainty. So the kind of basic core fundamental like self-confidence and what I call self-trust, which I think is in some ways even more fundamental, the kind of epistemic trust in your own ability to update your judgment in light of new evidence and to not BS yourself in effect. So they need to have the kind of earned credibility with themselves that like, if I will read the writing on the wall, if if customers are not chomping at the bit, if we have to chase after them, and if that seems to continue after several small pivots of the same basic, product or the same basic, use case, then I will not be afraid to say, this isn't working, and we need to pivot. And I will not be afraid to ask for help. And I will not be afraid to admit that I suck at this and that I don't know what I'm doing. And I'll be able to kind of look my imposter syndrome in the eye and reckon with the fact that, I signed up for something that by the very nature of it requires that I be a constant imbecile and beginner who doesn't know what they're doing. Because if someone already knew how to do this, they would have done it and the company would exist and I couldn't make this bet. So that's a huge part of it. And then across stages, communication is a really core need. And, with that, the emotional self-awareness and the even just the kind of humanistic attitude, the humanistic mindset of believing that other people can be gotten through to, believing that you can actually find win-win alignments with co-founders, with employees, and that sometimes firing an employee is actually the win-win solution, and that it's not going to either destroy them, or make you into a terrible person, but that actually it's much worse for both of you the longer you kind of, keep them on out of fear or pity. So those are some major things. And as as you get past what's called product market fit, like once they've sort of like figured out their core value proposition and they're scaling, then it's all leadership management people issues. And also just who am I now that I don't get to be the scrappy founder in the garage and I don't get to ever touch a line of code. Now I'm, the storyteller who's always fundraising or hiring, who is just constantly dealing with people and like becoming a people person or reckoning with the fact that they don't want to.
Yep.
And kind of either way, being honest with themselves and making the tough choices that actually align with their, best life.
And is all of this in the book?
That's a tiny little subset of a much larger
what else
list of
it.
Yes. I mean, I guess if I categorize the major themes in the book, it would be So one of the major themes is the idea that death is the default, and that I have gotten a ton of leverage out of this formulation ever since I kind of put words to it. The idea that by default, entropy takes its course, and everything falls apart, and we die, and that's not a function of vice or of ill intent or of some cosmic malevolent scheme. It just is. It's just nature. It's just the second law of thermodynamics, and that all the good things around us were painstakingly built through trial and error, through messy co-founder dramas and breakups, sometimes through hangings and witch trials that scientists had to undergo and still stand their ground, right? And to be able to kind of appreciate just how hard all of that was and is. Mm-hmm. And just be able to kind of get the perspective, like, no, right, I'm not supposed to already know what I'm doing. It's not supposed to be easy. The universe doesn't guarantee me any wins. It doesn't, guarantee my company's default dead. My relationships are default dead. And on the flip side, look what's possible in the face of all this entropy. Somehow, nonetheless, we built skyscrapers and we sent, humans into space, and, maybe soon to Mars. And so basically the default is not destiny. And so like that dual perspective turns out to actually get a lot of ROI, return on investment, epistemically, motivationally, because then it really kind of helps ground why it is that we need to build, why we need to be productive, that the default is not, well, we just kind of coast and we watch video games and somebody periodically feeds us and we live a life that's mindful and focused on the present moment and not worry about it. Like, no, the default is that, you rot and die. Yep. and so that's the kind of what gets it off the ground. And then there's a lot in the book on motivation and how we kind of build our values, that values aren't just sort of intrinsic and innate, that we develop them, we build them through iterative work, through engagement with projects in the world, and that there's not some predetermined purpose for us or some predetermined good, that we really need to build that for ourselves. You build a purpose, you don't find your purpose. And then there's a lot of material on sort of all the implications of that for how we kind of manage problems like quote unquote work-life balance, kind of just rethinking a lot of the commonplaces that we hear in the culture, like you need work-life balance. No, so what you're saying, work isn't part of life, and like it's already game over once you've split these two parts of your life, into these like beakers that you have to somehow keep in some made-up balance. But rather, like how do you actually want to integrate all the parts of your life so that they're all sustaining and fueling each other? And then how do you build knowledge, and what are all the ways that we lie to ourselves, all the ways that ignorance is the default, like how do we uphold a high bar of intellectual ambitiousness rather than the more commonplace intellectual humility? Don't pretend like you ever know anything, don't ever be certain. Well, no, actually, if you want to achieve big things, if you want to be ambitious, then you have to know a lot and you have to be right a lot. Also, that's really hard, and it has to be earned. And so, yeah, you'll go through long stretches of not knowing anything, but don't settle for that, and actually hold a high bar. And then there's lots of advice around thinking from first principles, kind of learning some of the lessons of Silicon Valley's best kind of thinking on this, in terms of how do you actually discover new ideas, and then how do you bring them to market? How do you actually tell a compelling story? And how do you make your knowledge emotionally real to yourself? How do you build win-win relationships? How do you communicate in a way that's both honest and respectful and constructive? When do you say no to, to relationships, to jobs, to versions of your life? And then how do you build your psychology to actually internalize all of these ideas that had been presented in the book up to that point? It's a long book.
It's a long book?
Yeah, I
You
mean,
said 130,000
I'm
words?
trying to whittle it down. Yes, from
Okay.
130,000 words, which is already whittled down from
I'm
some
sure.
even more ungodly number of words.
I'm sure.
That yeah.
How do you find the founders that you work with or the entrepreneurs you work with respond?
I mean, it's somewhat of a selection effect because the ones I work with are the ones who respond well and want to work with me and
Well, they stick around, I guess.
pay me a lot of money
Yeah.
to, peddle my wares. But I find that they respond well on average. There's a wide range in terms of what lands and what resonates and what doesn't.
Mhm.
Among my major like rallying cries, among the mantras that feature in my framework, one of the most commonly useful has been this idea of kind of checking our misanthropy at the door. That founders, I have found, to disproportionately have an implicit, in effect, cynicism about other people and about what people are capable of. And I wrote a Substack post kind of describing the developmental history of that psychology as I've come to understand it, that you're kind of born the one player character, usually in a random little community of not of NPCs, as founders like to call it, as non-player characters of lemmings,
Okay.
of secondhanders, whichever terminology we want to use. But you're kind of a fish out of water. You're the only nerd and the only obsessive, like hacker kid amongst a bunch of more kind of preppy, mediocre, not, particularly thoughtful peers. Your parents laugh at your ambitions with the best of intent. But, I hear so many stories of like, yeah, my parents nicknamed me Gollum because, I would get so obsessed with my interests. I'm like, Jesus Christ.
God, who are these parents? Yeah.
Yeah. And so they kind of grow up, and to cope with the loneliness and the like just the feeling of alienation and being misunderstood, they can't even grapple with the idea that everyone in the everyone in the world sucks except me. Like that seems like such a taboo thought, and also just an unbearable thought. And so they kind of turn it in on themselves. Maybe I'm the one, I'm just so obsessive, I'm weird, I'm autistic, I have all these problems, I'm the weird one. And so I'm this burden on society, but somehow they'll have to put up with me. And they kind of internalize this defect, kind of self-deprecating narrative. But deep down, they've never checked the original belief, the original premise, which is still sitting nested in there somewhere, which is like, everyone sucks, everyone's mindless, everyone's a lemming except for me, and this is an arid wasteland of mediocrity, and somehow I have to live here. You have to navigate this world. And so even at the point where like they've gone through Y Combinator and they've met some of the great living builders and entrepreneurs, like it doesn't actually penetrate that hidden mindset. It doesn't check the belief because they've never even admitted to having the belief. It's not explicit. And so they'll somehow twist it to fit the narrative. Like, well, sure, those repeat founders, they can afford to hire great people and they're able to be, like, for other people in some shiny fictional universe that's not mine, it's possible to find great talent. It's possible to actually expect excellence and to keep a high bar, but not for me. Because remember, I'm defective and obsessive and this and antisocial and this and this. And so it ends up becoming this vicious kind of, anti-pattern where they hire mediocre people because that's all they can, they assume that they can get. And then they're really resentful and frustrated. And that just reinforces their original unchecked, belief that people suck. And so then they also lower their own bar at some point on, their own performance. Because what can I really get to? What can you do when you have to deal with people? And, and it just kind of propagates. And then, so I called that piece the hidden belief that kills great startups, because I just see it over and over. And I mention this because of everything I've written. This is the one that's most often been communicated to me, like Gina, how did you looked inside my head? Did you write this about me? Like I've had founders who I had one call with them. At the end of the call, I would send that link as like, check this out. This could be useful. And the founder would like look at it on the call, would kind of skim it for a minute and look at me and like, did you just write this based on our call? What is going on? Like, this is really creepy. You're inside my mind. So that's really resonant, but there are various things that I've found are extremely resonant and that just don't get said often. Like you're an underserved population because you're ambitious, not because of anything that's wrong with you. Or, it's actually good to want to make money, and that can actually, that there's no mission without margin, and that if you get cynical about profit, then you should not be in this line of work. A lot of that kind of.
Do you find that they have that kind of cynicism about profit?
And the way you know more about this, I'm sure, than I do, but the weird political landscape and how it's affected Silicon Valley has led to this bizarre bifurcation into, there are still the kind of like recovering woke tech founders and tech, execs, leaders, etc. But they're kind of confused, that they don't know who they are anymore, but they're still kind of occasionally feeling like they need to pay homage to this or that, DEI, whatever, and then there are the Trumpy tech founders who like, okay, now I'm just going to let it all hang out. But then the cynicism doesn't go away. It just, flips, right? And so like, oh yeah, no, I'm going to cheat and steal and do whatever I got to do because it's, the strongest man wins.
Yeah.
And it's even worse on that side of things. So
yeah. And how many of them are turning to religion as a way to deal with that?
It's a good question. So I think I have a skewed sample because the ones who find me, they like my Substack, they resonate with my work. I'm pretty sure, if they do even a cursory Google search, they know, I'm affiliated with IRI and I've been objectivism. And so I don't think I get the super religious ones very often. But yeah, definitely there's been somewhat of an uptick in like last couple years of, I see that bifurcation of that there are founders who are kind of still very much in the like Buddhist meditation, let's do ayahuasca and get and try to become enlightened kind of camp. And then there's more so the kind of searching within Christianity and within the more right coded philosophical traditions kind of camp, alas.
So who'd you say the book is for?
I've given that so much thought, and my current working answer is that it's for anybody who already sees themselves as ambitious, as striving to be. So the phrase that I coined at one point while I was auditioning publishers was high agency humanist. This was actually before Jason Crawford came up with his like techno-humanist, manifesto that there's some overlap in our circles, so that's language that's sometimes useful for me too. But the kind of, it's definitely not, just tech people or just founders or any one slice, any one like industry per se. It can be college students, it can be athletes, it could be, homemakers who are rethinking what it means to be a homemaker. It could be, so I really think of it as, and this is sort of my Substack audience, and from what I can tell, my Twitter, audience, such as it is this eclectic mix of people from like the rationalist community, people from the parenting and education kind of, spaces, people obviously in tech and entrepreneurship, objectivists, or people who are in that general kind of libertarian-ish, part of the culture, but people who think of themselves as thoughtful, ambitious, and trying to think outside the box, like whether that means they're gray tribe or heterodox, this or that, or they're not necessarily in some camp, but they're also trying, to kind of self-create in some way. And they haven't quite figured out how, and they're getting into various failure modes in the process, but they have that drive.
So generally people with the drive, people who are trying to make their life better.
Yeah. And consciously so. I mean,
Yeah.
people who, when they see a book on the builder's mindset, a new psychology of ambition, or working title, or whatever
Yep.
in that vicinity ends up being like, that intrigues them.
Resonates with them. Yep. Resonates with them.
So,
You talked about self-trust before.
mhm.
How do you establish self-trust, and how much does an objectivist epistemology play into that?
It's a great question. I gave a talk in 20
Yeah, we've already decided
17.
we're bad on dates.
Yeah, clearly. Yeah, we're not to be relied upon as authorities on the timeline. But I think maybe 2017. Anyway, you can easily find it under its
Yep.
title, which is Earning Your Own Trust, The Psychology of Honesty. So I was at an Ocon. So I mean, no, it was 2019 because I was pregnant with Alice, with my first kid. And that was actually like a salient part of it. Anyway,
Mhm.
and at that point, I told the story of how, I had been studying Rand and objectivism since high school. And so that had been at least, over a decade at that point. And I was just figuring it out. So, and that I couldn't have figured it out, or at least it certainly would have been a much longer and sort of less kind of and muddier journey to kind of conceptualizing and then actually psychologically internalizing self-honesty as a virtue and as a practice, if not for objectivism. I mean, I'd gotten the core idea that faking reality is the kind of the only quote sin, right? And why? Not because of some deontological, categorical imperative, but just because it doesn't work. Reality is what it is, and when you fake it,
Yep.
it doesn't make it so. And then, but it wasn't until years later, when I was already post college and sort of journaling about the latest emotional upset, that I was kind of trying to sort through and realize that I basically didn't trust my judgment. And then that kind of sent me into this intellectual, I don't want to say spiral. I mean, a good spiral that actually had a resolution on the other side. But it kind of led me to make those connections for the first time between, okay, so Rand talks about, not lying to yourself and not faking reality, but how does that actually connect to why I end up miserable in these moments, and why so many things are hard, for why I procrastinate, and why I trust somebody else's opinion of, my writing or of what happened to me over my own. And one thing led to another. And then I just saw all of the different places in life where this comes up, and just how pervasive it is, and that it's characterological, and it's a long it's not just one premise, but it's like a bunch of interconnected premises and kind of assumptions and expectations and self judgments. And so like I have to somehow re-engineer that whole structure, and like a decade later, I was ready to give a talk on it. And another 6-ish years later, I feel like, I've got a pretty solid foundation. But yeah, so objectivism was a very important starting point.
So in redoing all those assumptions and rebuilding it all, give us a hint in terms of what that takes and what's involved.
Yeah, I mean, so the kind of like the MVP, wow, I've really become like inundated in these techie concepts.
Yeah.
The minimum viable product of of a practice of self-honesty is just to catch yourself when you're BSing, and just, that's the rep, to be able to notice that, wait a minute, is this, am I, Matt calls it being cognitive, my husband, Matt. That's kind of his shorthand for it. But like, okay, wait, am I actually, what am I after right now? Am I arguing this to myself or to, to whoever, because I believe it and it's really important to me to get the facts right? Or am I arguing this to myself because I'm really scared of what it would mean if it were untrue, or because I really don't want to look wrong to this person or to myself, or because it just seems like way too much work to have to like unravel this assumption that I've had for so long, or, for any of the myriad reasons why we might lie to ourselves, and to take the stigma out of that. So that's I would say, especially for this audience, which I imagine leans objectivist and leans moralistic in the way that I have seen we objectivists, tend to lean by default when we get into it, that there's going to be this flinching tendency to not want to come clean with ourselves about our own dishonesty and not want to admit that, we evaded, that we've been telling ourselves a story that's not actually truth motivated, that's serving some psychological function for us. And that is a huge, huge mistake. It's unnecessary because, there is no vengeful God waiting to smite you down. There's just your life and what you make of it. And the more time and opportunity you give yourself to be anchored in reality and to, get things right for the sake of having an accurate mental map, of the world you're living in, the better off you'll be, and it's between you and you. There's nobody else to account to. And so there's no shame. There's no, it's a choice, but the nature of choices is that, we make them in a context and that we can help ourselves make better choices depending on the kinds of conditions that we create for ourselves and the kind of thinking that we're, kind of willing to do. And so that's the biggest thing, is to just take the stigma out of it and to realize and to actually actively pride ourselves on every moment of admitting something hard to ourselves, even just I am not as sure of this as I have been acting like I am, or as I've been talking a big game about this particular thing in politics, about Trump or about, politics is like a notorious, petri dish for BS, right? Because nobody knows what they're talking about. And it's so detached and kind of impersonal. And yet, so easy to kind of get ourselves riled up and attach our identities to it. And so it's a great arena for practicing self-honesty. What have I been going around and parroting? What have I been getting all up in arms about that I don't actually understand? That I don't actually could I steel man the opposition, the best possible case of the opposition? If there's somebody on the other side or on some, other side that's rational, that's honest, what might their position actually be? And how do I know they're wrong? And how do I know I'm right? And do I know? Maybe I don't. And can I, so that's that's low hanging fruit. And then, in our relationships, in our decision-making about, whenever we have a conflict, whenever there's a trade-off between, comfort now, but at the cost of some longer term goal, or where we're not even sure, do we actually want this goal? Do we want to write this paper? Do we want, why are we pushing it off to the last minute? Just kind of taking those opportunities to notice what's in our, what we're saying to ourselves. And is there, what's fishy here? Just we might, notice that our friend is BSing us, and we don't disown the friend, but we might call their BS if we're a good friend, right? So kind of being that friendly BS caller to ourselves over and over, systematically over a long period of time. And you start accruing the benefits right away. And there are benefits to be accrued over a long time. You don't accrue the full benefits until you've really kept at it for a while.
How much is all of this motivated by secondhandedness, people caring way too much about what other people think of them and other people's views?
A fair amount of it. I would say, these things are all intertwined in my experience, and there's no one pathway. So, again, this death is the default idea. It does so much work for me. And so one of the ways it's clarifying for me is, okay, secondhandedness is the default. By default, we don't have our own views on things, but we have to have some view. And so we kind of just, by osmosis, we absorb the views that are in our milieu, right? So by default, we're going to be secondhanded until we actually build something firsthand, both in terms of knowledge, and in terms of actual, achievement, and worth. And by the same token, self-doubt is the default. So it might be that first you start out anxious and doubting yourself and doubting your decisions. Maybe you have some genuine, maybe, you're a band kid, or you're really academically motivated, but at some point you struggle to keep up with your own goal. Or at some point you realize I'm just checking boxes, but I don't actually know what any of it adds up to, or it's meaningless. So you realize there are other people who dropped out of high school to go build something real. And now suddenly you feel a loser who's never accomplished anything, and then at some point you start measuring yourself against some secondhand, benchmark, because now you don't, it's like you've been unmoored. You don't have your own yardstick anymore, right? And you haven't figured out, well, then if that's not how to be a good kid or a good person, then what is? And you latch on to the first available, template, right? And so then now secondhandedness is starting to kind of, infuse itself in your soul, or vice versa. You start out really like enticed by what other people, by the confidence that the cool kids seem to project. And so you start imitating and copying them. And then that leads you to be really unsure of yourself in other context, so it can develop in any number of ways, but by default, none of this stuff will already be online for you, until you build it.
So, any sense of when the book is going to be available? I'm sure people are wondering. I
have been trained to maintain a healthy patient non-specificity about that. It will be if I have to give a ballpark at this point, I would say, the 1 to 2 year range. Like that's just how long these things take, as I've come to understand. Penguin, is one of these
setting
massive
expectations low, so you don't stop bugging her about the book.
Yeah. So, but I will keep everybody posted, and hopefully I'll have the pub date sooner than that. So at least we'll all know. And at that point, I'll start to be able to like release little sound bites of it, and I'll have a cover at some point. So it won't be 2 years till you see something of the book, until you can maybe even pre-order the book, but it could be 2 years until you actually hold it in your hands.
When is, say something about the Substack. So where can people find you on the Substack?
So I write The Psychology of Ambition. So if you look up my name and The Psychology of Ambition, should be the first 1 or 2 things at least that pop up. I'm pretty sure if you just Google Psychology of Ambition, I still am the first to come up, and one of the only, by the way. So this is one of the reasons I staked out Psychology of Ambition, because I realized there is no other psychologist that calls themselves that. And, when I say it's an underrepresented problem.
Yeah, you're number one.
Yes.
You're number one. So and then right under it is Psychology Today, the case for ambition. Is that you?
That's interesting. I don't think so. I mean, for all I know, it might cite me.
The case for ambition, motivation. Oh, is it?
The Psychology and Philosophy. Oh, who's that? Some of these I haven't seen before.
Used to be a virtue. Somewhere along the way, it became a vice.
Indeed.
It's not bad. Yeah.
Wait, that's I wonder if any of these people, I'm not going to assume that they're citing me, but I'll take a look later behind the scenes. Because some of these are new. I mean, right, the years look pretty recent.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, but I don't know if any of them are actually call themselves psychologists of ambition. And normally there, it's a kind of, there's a nod to, there's some healthy ambition you could have, but there's also unhealthy ambition. You got to be careful to toe the line and so on, which is true, strictly true. Yeah. But the emphasis is almost always on, well, just don't set your sights too high, and don't let it get, toxic, and don't get too attached to outcomes, and so on and so forth.
National Institute for Health has the headline is Ambition and Its Psychopathology.
Yep, there you go. That's pretty standard. Yeah. That is what you would typically see.
Yeah.
Up until this point.
All right, good. So you're number one there. So that's an easy way to find you, and it takes you straight to the Substack, and you guys can sign up. And excellent.
By all means, you're all welcome. Yes, and I will be keeping my subscribers regularly updated on book progress.
Good. So let's jump to some of these questions, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Sure.
Monotropico from Australia. I don't know what time it is in Australia now.
Ooh,
what do you think of attempts to argue for a reason-emotion dichotomy in humans based on the differences between the two sides of the brain? Left brain is viewed as logical, while the right is viewed as holistic and intuitive.
I mean, so briefly speaking, I don't think any serious scientist really trucks with that theory at this point, that the left-right brain theory, because I mean, any modular theory of the brain, any like theory in which we have these clear partitions. There's the triune theory where there's the mammalian part, and then there's the reptilian and the mammalian and the higher cognitive, distinctly human. But serious scientists have disavowed any such kind of literal strict partitioning because there's just too much overwhelming evidence that it's all so interconnected and that every function it kind of overlaps with and mediates and enables other functions, and structures and functions do not neatly map onto each other, and the brain it just doesn't work that way. Even if even granting for a second the kind of neo-phrenology idea that we have this very strict left brain, right brain separation, and the right brain does all the creative stuff and the left brain does all the rational and intellectual, that still wouldn't map on or be evidence of a reason emotion split, because for one thing, emotions have rational content, and for another thing, our reasoning includes a lot of automatized premises and associations that we kind of pull into our reasoning process. And a lot of our reasoning happens within what's now called the default mode network, when we kind of just are left to our own devices and we're free associating, versus there's a different, and it's very much bilateral. There are plenty of different brain areas that are implicated and that are all kind of lighting up and supporting each other. And it's a very different kind of reasoning when we are given like a top-down kind of metacognitive instruction, like think of every word that starts with an S or whatever, and then it's a very different, it's a dorsolateral prefrontal control network that lights up. None of it maps cleanly, and reason and emotion wouldn't map cleanly onto any of the existing conceptions of brain areas anyway.
Yep.
I guess that's what I think of it.
Okay, Baker asks, what is meant by visibility in relationships? What is its importance in close personal relationships?
It's a great question. I've thought a lot about this concept. And so I'll answer how I typically use it and understand it. And then I'll say I think there's some variance in connotation. So the way I typically understand visibility is in terms of, in effect, kind of being understood and being seen in terms of your values, your kind of your achievements, your just like what you believe, the thoughts you've come, your inner world being reflected in another who gets it. It's like, oh yeah, this person gets me. I feel seen. I've been, it's and it doesn't always have to be a person. It could be like you're reading a novel and this character gets it. This character is actually describing this inner experience that you thought you were alone, and having, or that you couldn't even fully put words to, but now you're realizing, wow, yes, this is the loneliness, or, this is the kind of longing that, I know a lot of people, myself included, who first read Rand's novels had this kind of experience where it's like, you're finally seeing your own soul kind of reflected back to you. And so that is a broad sense of visibility that I think is a real, human need and a tremendous value in relationships. But there's another sense of visibility. I have to credit many arguments and conversations over the years with Greg Salmieri about this, mainly, maybe Matt a little bit, although I can't remember how much of this he contributed. Sometimes the two of them blur together in terms of like the specific arguments they make. They form a kind of philosophical front. But anyway, but there's another sense of visibility, which is the concretization of your internal values and, and premises in the form of another, whether that's a person, like I am in love with this person because this person like embodies what I love about humanity and about the world. This person embodies ambition or embodies that kind of like integrity and honesty that I so value in myself and in, and that I spend so much of my, effort and life promoting, and like, I can see it embodied. I can see it concretized in this person. And arguably, a Greg would argue that that's the more important form of visibility, that it's really being able to kind of see your values embodied and concretized, which is related, right? That
Yeah,
there's
they
a
seem to
kind
be
of
related
mirror
to one another. Yeah.
effect. But yeah, I would say, they're complementary and you need both. And yeah, visibility and inspiration, the way I used to conceptualize it, at least, is like these are to kind of two of the spiritual needs that relationships serve, apart from all of the more transactional needs, like obviously we trade goods and we, share resources with each other, but more fundamentally and kind of on that more spiritual level, we inspire and we give visibility to each other. But so.
How much does the concept, if at all, enter into the book? What's the idea of psychology of ambition?
The idea of being seen and seeing in relationships as important definitely comes up. I don't remember if I use the term, I maybe use it once. So it's not, it definitely doesn't like feature extensively, but.
No. But do you think like in employment or leadership, is that where, being seen and.
Any communication that has any kind of stakes to it, which I think, if you're bothering to communicate, it's because, you have some sort of value at stake and something that you're trying to trade with another human. And so whether that's employer-employee, whether that's, a lot of the current relationship work that I do in coaching is with co-founding teams. So, a collaborator, a colleague, but also, or a friend or a romantic partner, whatever the case may be, a lot of the same kind of basic tooling applies. There's a talk I did at another Ocon called Deeper Connection Through Mutual Selfishness, where a lot of the kind of early material on this topic was already kind of previewed, at least. So,
good. So big, I think, is a follow-up on visibility. If someone in a relationship where they are not getting any visibility and yet giving it constantly, what might that indicate about the relationship? What can they do about it?
Well, it sounds like there's not a win-win values alignment and, a win-win trade happening in that relationship. I would have questions about how much do they need visibility and what is the nature of that need and why is it being, is it being withheld? Is it that, what are the imbalances in this relationship and how problematic are they? And more importantly, like what value is being exchanged, so to the extent that, the way the question is worded, I would imagine like the gestalt that I'm getting is, this is a relationship where one person is being walked over and is in effect, prostrating themselves for the other and is not getting their needs met. In which case that to me is a common example of a relationship that either needs to be repaired or ended, depending on, the nature of the problem, but that, and that the person being walked all over has agency and responsibility, right, in that relationship, that they're also playing a part in not setting their, boundaries, not expressing their needs, not being selfish, kind of appropriately and, rationally selfish for both their sakes about the fact that this isn't working for me. This is not sustainable. You're not actually meeting my needs. I hope that answers the question.
Richard, do you think Rand would have insisted on using the word selfishness if she had raised toddlers?
Oof. Interesting. Would she have I have no idea, first of all. I would like to disclaim anything that comes out of my mouth from this point forward in answering this question, because I can't possibly answer that counterfactual. I can speak to my own experience raising toddlers. I don't really use the word currently. It doesn't actually, where I get concerned about it is when we're reading, like fairy tale, we're reading children's books or watching movies, and inevitably it comes up as a vice, right? And this selfish prince who only cared about, or vanity also comes up, which is an interesting one. We've had conversations with our almost 6-year-old about, this person's really vain, by which she means either that they're kind of like superficial and, unthinking, or in some cases, like actually that they're really like concerned with their appearance, and it's all kind of packaged together. And so Matt and I have both kind of pushed on this, like, what's wrong with caring how you look if you're thoughtful about, like that maybe the more helpful concept here is like thoughtful versus unthoughtful, or kind of mindless, where vanity kind of packages these things together. And same whenever we encounter selfish, like I either just skip over it, but now I can't do that because she reads. fluently. And so she'll just read it and just internalize it with my never having any say over it. So then I'll open a conversation about what's selfish here, and does that mean like, what is really going wrong in this relationship between, Cinderella and the stepsisters? And is it that they're, that they don't care about her, they care about it, but like they're kind of jealous, aren't they? And they're really mean-spirited about trying to make things worse for her instead of trying to make things better for themselves. Yeah, it's a good question, because I do think about like, when is it actually useful to bring in selfishness as a term? And I don't find it as often useful as, I don't know, as one would assume, given that it features so prominently in objectivism. But maybe I should. Maybe I'm shying from it, to the detriment of my persuasiveness.
I mean, it's tricky given that the entire culture views it in a completely different way than we do. And it's
a hill to die on. Like, if you're going to choose it as a hill to die on, go ahead, but then you got to die on it, in the sense of like, you have to do a lot of work to then unpack what is normally meant by it and what you mean, but where you could achieve most of the same result by just using different words. But on the other hand, you are sort of then conceding, okay, well, this is just going to be this package deal that I'm not touching.
I think you have to at least seed in their mind the possibility of something good here.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they're too young to comprehend the totality of the meaning of the concept, but at least it's possible to seed. When it's used in books and in movies, maybe they're not using it quite right. Maybe that's not what they mean. Right?
That's right. Exactly. Like, the more important thing is that I want my kids to understand that like caring about their own needs and well-being and happiness is good and necessary and important, and that it doesn't come at the cost, that relationships are either win-win or lose-lose. This is one of my big mantras, that it's not, kill or be killed. It's not you versus them. It's like, do you want to lift all boats, or do you want to destroy?
Andrew says, in an ideal society, would psychology be more aimed at optimizing for happiness rather than removing neurosis? I think
in an optimal psychology.
What's that?
No, sorry. I was just making sure I heard it. Was it in an optimal psychology?
In an ideal society,
would it be
optimizing for happiness, or would it be removing some neurosis? I think focusing on strong, rational mental patterns could cure most weak, irrational mental patterns formed in you.
That's interesting. Good question. So I think it would be configured somewhat differently. I think there would be more interest in and emphasis on what I call ceiling raising, which I've staked out as my distinctive MO as a psychologist, because nobody else, by and large, cares about it, at least in clinical psychology, meaning in the study of mental health, applied psychology, where most of the emphasis has historically been on alleviating, dysfunction or suffering or illness. But a few things to say about that. One, there's a whole field of positive psychology that's just all about that, where the whole emphasis, from Marty Seligman, from Bandura, from like the whole kind of a fairly long tradition now in psychology of like more humanistic psychologists, and explicitly what they call positive psychologists, who like they've been trumpeting this exact, point and this exact need, that like we need to not just focus on reducing suffering and, minimizing the stress and symptoms, but we need to like actually care about flourishing and optimism and gratitude and well-being and so on and so on. That said, it's somewhat of a superficial field today, by and large, in the sense that the concepts aren't that, kind of robustly defined, and usually measured with self-reports, self-report questionnaires that ask you for your subjective well-being on a scale of 1 to 10, and often they're kind of measuring like state rather than more enduring trait level differences in, I feel hopeful and optimistic after I read this little vignette about somebody helping somebody across the street, and often the emphasis is very much on the kind of usual, ethical strains of what, of beneficence and generosity and charity and helping others versus productiveness and ambition and achievement, though there are little pockets of psychology that deal with those too. To the last part of the question, can most psychological ills, or I remember how it was put, most like irrationalities, what was it? Be cured.
Cure most weak, irrational mental patterns formed in youth. So could you, does the positive cue you from the negative in a sense?
Yeah. So I think it depends on the scope that we have in mind when we refer to these weak, irrational mental patterns. If we mean, like you have some errors of judgment, like, you think that you should be altruistic, and sometimes that sort of features in your choices about where to send money, and then you learn the positive ideals, and premises that you sort of correct your thinking, absolutely. Or I mean, there are various errors you could hold growing up that simply, I mean, it's not, it's not a simple matter to be onboarded to an entire positive, rational philosophy and then to like study it and understand it and work your way through what do these different concepts actually mean for my life, and how do they relate to each other, and what does it look like when I'm embodying them versus not. I mean, that's a lot of work anyway. Even if we just kind of assume you're studying the positive, rational, perspective. But also you do have a lot of unlearning to do typically, even in the routine case where since childhood you've assumed that, everyone sucks. Well, as I've mentioned, like that's gonna show up in all sorts of subtle behavior patterns and habits that you form that you don't even realize are in any way connected. Like you tend to kind of just go and do it yourself if somebody doesn't understand your feedback right away, or, you tend to either kind of quickly give up on people, or you give them like endless chances despite the growing resentment, and never actually fully tell, like fully communicate to them why you're upset with them, because deep down you don't believe they could change anyway. But like those are not the kinds of things where now I have a positive view, so those all just melt away. Like you actually have to, notice those patterns and watch for them and deliberately disrupt them time and again in a bunch of different contexts before you can really generalize a new perspective and sort of like really build it into your soul.
Yep.
So.
Let's see, friend Hopper, can you recommend books on neuroplasticity? I've read 2 of Norman Dolge's books, and Hardwiring Happiness. I'm interested in what it takes to change your mind versus persuasion. Peikoff's Art of Thinking got me thinking about this.
So I guess it depends on when you say neuroplasticity, do you mean specifically on like that neuroscientific phenomenon? Or is that a term of art we're using just for psychological change? Because that's a much broader topic, and I can probably recommend more books on that broad topic. Whereas I don't know if there's any one book that I could like give an unqualified recommendation for with respect to the narrower topic of neuroplasticity, because, I'm not a neuroscientist. I haven't been following that sort of literature. The books I do know are all.
He's talking about psychological change works too.
Okay. So. Okay. I mean, in that case, there's such a vast library of possible books to read. I guess, would it be a cop-out to recommend one of my articles first as a sort of as an entry point? I cite various things in that article, so that would also provide some. It's actually not on my Substack. Well, I refer to it on my Substack, but I couldn't repost the whole article because it was copyrighted. So it's in defense of radical self-betterment, where I kind of outline my approach to psychological change as it occurs, in therapy and coaching. And I kind of follow several examples of figures who've exemplified this process, including one of those figures is Marsha Linehan, who herself is a psychologist who developed a pioneering form of treatment called dialectical behavior therapy. Her book, her memoir called Building a Life Worth Living, which is a title that I almost would have stolen had she not taken it. Right? Isn't that a great title?
That's a great title.
The book is mixed. It's all over the place. It's spiky in the way that, interesting, ambitious people tend to be. Mm-hmm. But at its highs, it is so high in my estimation. It's real. She's a true pioneer and, wacky and has all sorts of weird views, but it's okay because, you take it's always on us anyway to, mine for gems and to separate the wheat from the chaff. So her book and kind of her whole approach is one I'd recommend. But yeah, In Defense of Radical Self-Betterment is my article where I cite a bunch of stuff.
Good. Wes asks, do you think a healthy adult that has never had an interest in sex should see a therapist?
I mean, absent more context, which I'm loath to proceed without more context, probably, but it depends. I mean, there are I've learned of physical conditions that actually would make it really, unnatural and hard to develop like sexual arousal. And I mean, they're rare, but they exist, and like, there are obviously so many different contexts somebody could find themselves in where, they're in I guess I would also ask, what do you mean by healthy adult? Like everything else is going great for them. They have a flourishing career and great friendships and they're living a full, happy life, but they just don't want any romance. Well, then who's to say that they're not fulfilled as they are? And then maybe they just haven't met the right person. But that also doesn't feel like a typical case, right? It feels like if somebody's got no interest in sex, like probably there are some, insecurities or inhibitions there, or there's some history of whether it's trauma or whether it's, kind of weird religious views that have been inculcated, or, like insecurities about appearance, or there's some fetish that just like has no, opportunity to kind of get actualized day to day, There's just so many possible reasons why someone might kind of want to look into that, but I wouldn't assume.
But it probably makes sense to see a therapist and see where it goes.
Yeah. I mean, it's like if the person, if it's a first personal question, then yes. Like if a person themselves is thinking, should I see a therapist? I don't seem to have any interest in sex. Yeah, go for it. It's the questions on your mind, probably worth getting some thought partnership to figure it out. So yeah, that's how
Any advice on how to find, just generally, how to find a good therapist?
Yeah, I knew the question would come up. So like I'm a broken record here. I wrote a post on this very question. I mean, it's good, right? The whole point of writing these posts is so that then I can just refer people to my post. Exactly. And this piece in particular was in that kind of spirit because I get this question so often and I feel so bad for just the sheer dearth of reliable, information on where there are competent providers or who is competent or what you can expect from them. So I wrote this kind of little primer. So it's called The Builder's Guide to Finding a Therapist, right? That's what it's called. So, and it is on my Substack, but if you just Google The Builder's Guide to Finding a Therapist, then it's the first thing you should see.
Perfect. All right, let's see. Richard, when I took objectivism through Rand's fiction, I found I had psychological resistance to pride and conflicts with pride versus mercy. What resources can my psychotherapist and I use to help me overcome issues like this?
Okay, so issues like having trouble with pride, and pride versus mercy. I'm not sure why those are on one axis. Is it like justice versus mercy? But I mean, as far as pride goes, I mean, I would say, there's the whole canon of like cognitive behavioral therapy kind of tooling for building self-esteem and for developing, for kind of checking our premises when it comes to our own kind of self-deprecation or self-doubts about our worth and kind of where we've learned that. I mean, particularly more modern, quote, third wave approaches that kind of also help you look at the function that our own kind of self-deprecations are serving. Like what would happen to be like checking the fear that might make it scary or hard to admit to feeling proud of yourself. Like, what is the fear? Well, I will turn out to be full of myself, or people will think I'm stuck up and they what? So what? And why would that be bad? Then they're not going to want to associate with me anymore. Okay, good. Is that true? What is my evidence? Like actually just surfacing those underlying assumptions and then subjecting them both to, rational kind of scrutiny and testing. So, from a kind of CBT standpoint, there's cognitive restructuring. There's figuring out like, why do I actually, I feel this because I think what? And then there's exposure, which is, or what I call, collecting corrective experiences by acting opposite, by kind of doing the thing that feels scary. And in this case, I'd be like, what happens when I just own my accomplishments? What happens when I say out loud, I'm really proud of myself? It feels uncomfortable. And what? Do people look at me weirdly? Does it feel arrogant to have said it? Does it actually, oftentimes each time you do it, you're kind of surprised, and it maybe violates some of those expectations and assumptions and provides rewards that you might not have anticipated. And so slowly, it becomes more second nature.
Good. Hopefully that's helpful, Richard. Let's see. Not your average algorithm. What is narcissistic supply?
I don't know. Just going to go ahead and own this one. I am not, off the top of my head, I do not remember that term, but
next, a lot of questions about narcissism. Let's see. What is the difference between a narcissist and a sociopath? Is it only a matter of degree?
So, okay. So if we want to get definitional here, based on the DSM and based on our existing definitions and classifications, such as they are, first of all, a sociopath, sociopathy is a kind of outdated term. We now mostly talk about psychopathy. Sociopathy is the kind of more specifically kind of socially focused version of psychopathy. Though psychopathy is still pretty social. Mostly it's just been reconceptualized, not as like specifically that you're anti, people, but that you generally lack conscience and remorse, and it's, I often have laughed at the kind of ridiculousness of this particular DSM category, because it's basically the catch-all for like the bad person disorder. Antisocial personality in particular, and then psychopathy is like the bona fide version of antisocial personality disorder, where you need it to be even more kind of developmentally early, and you need various other criteria. But anyway, psychopathy is, you lack kind of conscience and empathy and like moral, whatever kind of moral standards, and you sort of get off on hurting people in effect, or on getting a rise on you seem to need some sort of stimulation via getting like extreme or intense reactions, or via getting people to do things, because you don't seem to like experience the kind of spiritual value that one might otherwise get from a human connection or relationship. And then narcissism is the excessive and so depending on which kind of narcissism, so there's grandiose and there's quote unquote vulnerable narcissism. But basically, it's when you have an overinflated self view as presented to the people around you, and as reflected in your own kind of apparent beliefs and statements about yourself. Any psychologist who like seriously studies narcissism, or who thinks about it for even a tick, would tell you it's an insecurity driven diagnosis. It's not high self-esteem. It's, pretend self-esteem. So, they're not the same thing at all, but sometimes they might overlap, or they might look similar externally. And also there are real questions we should be asking about, are these even going to end up being like natural kinds, as we learn more about mental health issues.
Yeah. So not your average algorithm follows up with, what is your psychological analysis of Donald Trump?
Oh, God.
Has he lived a life of genuine
I guess
ambition?
This was inevitable. Wait, as what? Sorry.
Genuine ambition. Has he lived a life of genuine ambition?
Well, that was easy.
Yeah.
Next question.
And he set you up with a narcissism before. So,
I know. I almost, I had to inhibit saying Trump, but then you just went ahead and put it on a platter for me. So yeah, I mean, if there's such a thing as narcissism, then Donald Trump is a narcissist. I think at this point it's fairly safe to say.
Yep.
So, and no, I do not think he has lived a life of genuine ambition by any possible stretch, by any remotely sensible definition of any of those terms.
Yeah. So Richard follows up with you mentioned self-doubt as a default.
Mm-hmm.
Would you elaborate on that?
By default, again, as I mentioned before, we don't know what we're doing if we venture into any sort of remotely, challenging or new or difficult. I mean, really anything we do for the first time, it's like we pick up an instrument, we pick up a new, field of study. We're going to have very little knowledge and very little context, right? We're building skills from scratch. And so at first, like, we're not going to have a lot of sort of like fluency in knowing even, what foot to put in front of the other. And to the extent that we're either expecting to already have some form of, like mastery or fluency, to the extent that we're kind of gauging our ability or our, like our capacity, our worth, our potential based on how we're doing at a given point in time in any given, endeavor that we haven't mastered, like we're going to doubt ourselves and we're going to feel inadequate. And that's where imposter syndrome becomes such a common, phenomenon for anybody doing anything hard. I do think, it's the default only downstream of the fact that having these kinds of like artificial standards of worth and standards of competence is the default, because it's hard to come up with a real meaningful metric of progress or a real meaningful, a benchmark of success, or to even know like what are we trying to be successful, what actually matters, what is important, how fast do we need to be progressing? Does it matter that we're slower than, Johnny over here? And like, do we have the same goals as Johnny has? What do we want to ultimately do with this, like whatever the instrument that we're learning or the sport that we're playing, or, with like, why do we need to get good grades? Right. And it's really hard to kind of form a first-handed conception of like the good and the true. And so to the extent that we kind of by default will tend to latch on, or just kind of, we have on hand kind of these more artificial, like superficial metrics that almost never accurately map onto the actual like difficulty of learning something, right? Or the complexity of like actually mastering a skill. And so we'll tend to feel inadequate to the task, or we'll tend to doubt whether we're doing it right. Right. And just, I mean, it's also not all self-doubt is unhealthy, right? Like in some cases, yeah, no, you should be doubting whether this is actually the right path for you, so.
Will there be an audiobook? Cobb asks.
I believe that is in the contract. So yes.
Cobb says, my intuition is that pornography is harmful to mental health. Are there rigorous psychological studies that demonstrate the harm?
I don't know about rigorous. I'm sure there are many, many studies. I haven't, read up on them closely. It's not my area of expertise. It's an area I've actually been wanting to get more exposure to, not just porn specifically, but just like sexual psychology, the psychology of sex, gender, not only because it's so in the air, but because I think it's another neglected, generally understudied area of life, given how important it is. I'm sure there are studies that speak to correlations, at least, if not like causal pathways to various kinds of mental health challenges. I know there are. I couldn't like cite a specific other, but I've seen them around and seen in other contexts. There are treatments for porn addiction, right? And those treatments usually involve treating comorbid or like co-occurring depression, anxiety, social anxiety disorder, kind of attentional difficulties, kind of issues that arise, insecurities that arise, but also that can give rise to watching lots and lots of porn.
Yep. Cobb, is Trump derangement syndrome recognized as a legitimate mental disorder in clinical psychology? And is there any basis for its inclusion in the DSM?
It is not. And no, I do not think it has any basis in, rigorous scientific epidemiological studies.
No. And if you're not deranged by Trump, there's something wrong with you.
Indeed, indeed. I mean, sure, but not like in some bona fide clinical sense,
exactly.
right? Because then that would be quite the high prevalence diagnosis.
Monotropic says, what do you think of the gut being thought of as a second brain due to the influence of gut microbiome exerts on the central nervous system?
What do I think of that? I mean, again, not an area of, this is not within my main areas of expertise. I'm sort of peripherally aware of cool research on gut biome, like factors and treatments coming out, or preventative, prophylactic treatments. But I mean, the idea that it would be a second brain seems overwrought and seems like an overreach, but we are mind and body. And so there are certainly plenty of bidirectional influences between our physical and psychological health and state.
Nicola, any thoughts about this is a small topic. Any thoughts about Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung?
Many thoughts.
Make it short, though.
Yaron's like embracing himself. Like, oh God, here we go. Gena's off to the races.
That's too open-ended of a question.
Yeah, and for me, of all people who could make any question an open-ended question, as let's see. Let me keep it brief. I'll give you like the first fractal, brief response, and then we can double click on anything. I think they both deserve a great deal of, credit as fathers. I mean, Freud in particular was sort of the father of my field, clinical psychology. He kind of was the first to really turn it into like a discipline of study, the psyche, and not just, what we say on the surface, but what's going on under the surface, under the hood, which we have all continued to be interested in across different traditions. We just obviously have different accounts of like what's subconscious or unconscious, and where does it come from, and what accounts for it, it not being conscious, and how do we make it conscious, and so on. And there's obviously much wrong, in my view, with Freud's theories and his kind of whole worldview, but I think we owe him a debt. Jung, I would say somewhat similarly, he, I think he was more proto-scientific in some ways than Freud. I think he kind of ventured far and wide in terms of his theorizing in a way that wasn't quite as I think as clinically grounded. I mean, Freud obviously also went far beyond the data, but Freud attempted at least to operationalize his kind of psychological concepts and categories by reference to observation. And Jung and his sort of theory of archetypes, largely draws on sort of like a philosophical inheritance that he's pretty loose and poetic about. But I think there are some really powerful ideas and influences from him that have continued to bear fruit. So I'm not totally down on him.
Okay, let's see. Elon Musk.
Okay, here we go.
Elon said that he has used ketamine to manage depression. What does scientific evidence say about the effectiveness of ketamine in treating depression?
I'm not going to give you the perfectly up to date, most recent, effect size, but last I checked, there's really promising research on ketamine as another, potential adjunct treatment / alternative treatment for non-responders. There are lots and lots of different experimental treatments for depression. There's ECT, where you electrocute somebody's brain, which works bizarrely well for reasons that we still can't begin to fathom. But for specifically cases of really severe treatment-resistant depression, there's obviously SSRIs, different kind of classes of antidepressants. There's therapy, ketamine, and kind of some of the other more recent experimental kind of pharmacological treatments, they seem to be promising for like subsets of the population that don't respond well to other treatments. And I think that's cool. And ketamine in particular might interestingly interact with therapy or with certain kinds of like therapeutic learning. Again, this is all based on probably outdated kind of research archives that I'm digging through, but where there have been some cool studies that like actually someone with OCD who is given ketamine, then like there's this kind of window of openness to new learning and sort of kind of breaking of old associations and forming of new ones, such that in therapy, if you do an exposure exercise where you kind of like, if you have contamination OCD and you touch a toilet and then you don't wash your hands, you're quicker to learn and quicker to then, feel less distressed the next time that you touch a contaminant. So that's cool.
Cobb asks, can you discuss your PhD thesis on rumination?
You said it funny.
I'm sure I did.
You're articulated.
Not what a word I use.
You're probably none the worse off, right? I used it
I'm sure you did.
and
yeah.
I hope well. But anyway, sure, quickly. I did my dissertation research on, so rumination was kind of like my big interest and the motivating kind of question, the mechanism I wanted to better understand. But the study itself was a study of different strategies for recovering from a failure experience and re-engaging in goal pursuit after an initial setback. And so technically, so rumination, we measured rumination tendencies and rumination during task, but the specific research question was actually more positively framed. It was around the value of basically kind of thinking about your why, like what is the value of getting better at this task, but basically thinking about the how. So like, what is a specific strategy I can use to kind of do well or get better on this task? And doing both in succession, the how and the why. And I, my thesis was, my hypothesis was that you actually get sort of compounding benefits from thinking through both, the why and the how, kind of both the value and the execution. So, and that bore out specifically for participants who tended to ruminate a lot, which was very cool to see because they were the ones I thought needed it the most, because what they do by default is dwell on how terribly they did and what this means about them as terrible people who will never amount to anything. So
cool. Cobb says, how long range should goals be? Many entrepreneurs talk about decade-long goals, but I don't find goals beyond a few months motivating.
How long-term should goals be? I mean, it definitely depends. And I don't think there's one right length of, one right duration for all your goals, because, you might have reason to set extremely short-term goals depending on what you're trying to learn or what you're trying to accomplish or build, or what's the kind of epistemic context. Like, do you even know that this is something you like to do? In which case, maybe your goal is just like to spend a week exploring something, or do you know that this is something there's a need for, in which case your goal might be to, ask around and see if there's a need for this thing. Or, and also, it depends partly on what are you committing to, like, and what are the kind of dependencies between what you like, whatever it is you want or are setting your sights on, and what you need to, like, what are, what stepping stones you need, and kind of just like what time needs to pass, right, in order to get. So like, if you want kids, you should have some long-term goals.
Yep.
Because whether you like it or not, the next 18 years of your life are going to be a certain way, and there will be constraints. And so, if you have, in other words, either you have a goal of raising a family, or you don't, or you have some other goal that's incongruent with that. And like, you can't do that one short term. Right. And so there are lots of other things like where like,
you can't start a business short term, right?
That's right. So you can't, if you're going to raise investments for it, right?
Yep.
You can,
Yep.
if you're just tinkering, right?
Yep.
And it's easier than ever to do that in the age of AI. You can be a solopreneur, and you can sort of like ship products as you build them and see what sticks. And like, that's a perfectly tenable, way to make a living. And for some people, that's actually really preferable to the kind of venture-backed, kind of high growth startup model. But if you're going to take millions of dollars from investors who are betting on you to execute on a very specific long-term vision of capturing a market with a new product, you're going to you are defrauding those investors if you're not, in fact, thinking long-term about what you're planning to do and how long you're willing to, stick it out. So it's really contextual.
Good. Let's see. Andrew, Harry been someone who tells a story. He told Rand, what attracted him to objectivism was he saw that other ideas were BS. She said she was disappointed. What about seeking the truth?
For example.
Yeah. Do you think
Harsh.
seeking the truth is motivation by love in action?
Wait, is that a question?
Yeah.
Sorry, the question is, do I think motivation by truth is
if they think that seeking the truth is motivation by love in action?
I think it's an instance of it, certainly.
Yep.
And this is assuming like you're seeking the truth in a context where like you have reason to be really curious, and this is something you really want to know and need to know because it's going to have, implications for your life or your studies, or, it's not truth in this like platonic sense of just, contemplating in the ivory tower how many angels fit on a pin or whatnot. But yeah, I mean, to the extent that you see the value of knowledge for life, then absolutely.
Yeah. So Richard S. Rand concludes the Selfishness Without a Self essay with, quote, the split psychoepistemology of compartmentalized minds, citing men who seek refuge from irrationality in their work. How do you counsel founders who do this?
So you're talking about, sorry, the compartmentalism. So the line is that
so they have irrationality in their life, and they seek work as a refuge from that.
I mean, that's a phenomenon that occurs. I mean, you can be compartmentalized in any number of directions. Again, compartmentalization is the default, right? It's one of the defaults. And I think since Musk was mentioned earlier, I think he's a really salient modern day example of how much it's the default. Where he's the same man who brought us private space flight, like who thought from first principles, from maybe I buy a rocket and I, like fund some space exploration too. Wait a minute, I can just build rockets myself. It's cheaper to do, and it's wildly overpriced. And by the way, maybe we can actually send them into space way faster and way cheaper. Like the same man who brought us that is also the same man who cites conspiracy theories on Twitter willy-nilly and renames it X because of some lifelong vendetta. Like, this is the same man, but these are very different versions of this man. And clearly he has not integrated himself, and it's, it's not an easy thing to do. And so you can see it, definitely there are people who drown themselves in work. But I mean, even that, like, it's an over pathology of like, maybe in fact they love their work, but they'd have no idea how to apply that same agency and intentionality to their love life. Or, think of Hank Rearden, right? Who thrives in his work and loves his work and is so assertive in his work, but then has no idea what to do with Lillian and thinks that he's a blackguard for, his attraction to Dagny, and that it's evil to sleep with her. And like,
so what do you counsel founders who have this?
Which this?
The compartmentalization.
Yeah.
Compartmentalization.
Yeah. I mean, again, like there's just no one compartmentalization. Like,
so
there are founders who there are, I mean, I could like just rattle off a couple of versions of this. Like there are founders who they're so thoughtful with customers, and they love customer development, and they love just like really getting inside, the mind and the kind of workflow of, like an engineer, and figuring out exactly the product to build for that engineer. But when they have to get in front of investors, it's like, these people can't be reasoned with. They're just after my, they just want a quick buck, and I don't have anything really to say to them. And this is such a waste of my time, or when they're, out with friends, or when they're dating, they're like super, inhibited and shy and insecure, even though here they're like, they shine on sales calls and customer. I mean, I see this all the time. This is such a common phenomenon. It's like, and oftentimes the move is actually just to notice that, and then to really consciously think about how to apply the skills you already have here. How do you, let's actually think about dating as a sales funnel. Let's just see how that goes. Let's just make a CRM. I mean, this is more than one client of mine, more than one founder, who they had to make their CRM, like their, customer, which
relations management
manager. Thank you. Right. Like the spreadsheet that they use for their sales funnel, for their, fundraising funnel. And then they had to track the DMs that they send per week. And then they had to track, through the funnel, like how many messages they were responded to, and how many of those yielded a date. And like, it worked. And, and they started out like, I'm undateable, and there's nobody out there who could possibly be attracted to me. And like 2 weeks later, like, oh, I just had this amazing conversation with a girl,
Good.
So.
Cobb asks, Steve Jobs said that using hallucinogenic drugs gave him clarity about life's purpose. Is that possible, given that hallucinogens do not provide objective knowledge about the real world?
That's a great question. So it's not only possible, it is demonstrable that this happens to some people. And other things that happen to some people are, people have a near-death experience. They like almost get, they get run over by a car, or they have a cancer diagnosis that like, could have easily killed them, and they had to go through chemo, or, any number of, or like they're, they survive an assault, God forbid, any number of things. And then they emerge from it with a new sense of purpose and a new sense of clarity. And like, now I understand that life is precious and what life is really about. Right. Or like they have a child, and then for like, they just put away the last cigarette that they're ever going to smoke. And after like 20 different quit attempts that were totally futile, and they never seemed to be able to quit, even though they went through programs and smoking cessation protocols and this, they see the strip that says they're having a baby, and they put away the last cigarette they're ever going to smoke, So, okay, well, what is it about psychedelic trips that for some people result in these, or, like newfound insights or these transformations? Well, I think it's in a way a common pattern that we see across a bunch of these shakeups, where people are thrust out of their kind of normal default status quo day-to-day existence, and they're pushed to question things that they hadn't really questioned before, right? They're pushed to rethink, to kind of like think fresh in some way about like, but what actually am I here for? And what actually is important? And what really is life about? And by doing that, sometimes, now most people who have a psychedelic trip, they don't end up transformed. They don't end up with brilliant insights, or they might say they do. And then a week later, it's a flaky breakthrough. They're back to where they started. But some people actually really do. They like leverage that experience, because, I'm having never actually taken a psychedelic to date, curious, tried sometime and controlled environment. Like, my understanding is it's a wild and wacky experience where you really like just see the world in a whole different way, and it's bizarre, and you don't know what's happening. And it's sort of like, I mean, I think, but we can approximate that sort, when we're like drunk or high or sleepy, or, what, like there are certain ways that our brain can kind of get rejiggered. And, I mentioned ECT earlier, where you literally just shock somebody's brain. Why would that cure someone's depression? But it does, literally the reboot, where you unplug and replug, but it's the brain.
Yep.
So, that's my general take on it.
All right. The best, Tom says, just wanted to shout out Gena. She is my coach and has had such an impact on my life. Highly recommended.
Why, thank you.
It's very nice, Tom.
I'm
Rob, thoughts on DSM and on Thomas SZASAS.
SAS,
Yeah.
the mental illness denier.
Yeah.
I think he's wrong, but I think that he was responding to other wrongs that needed, responding to. I think, there was and still is, though not to that same extent, a lot of, over pathologizing and sort of, reductionistic kind of over medicalizing of psychological challenges, problems of living, as at least some subset of mental health disorders turns out to be, in contexts where either, so Sauce's view is it's actually society that's broken and, and bad, like the individuals themselves, nothing's wrong with them. It's really just that they're being, kind of put into this kind of straitjacket, sometimes literally, of social norms that are kind of restrictive and arbitrary. I mean, that's wrong. And if you've ever actually encountered real mental illness, then you know that it's wrong.
Yep.
There is real mental illness. There's mental illness that is, organically caused or at least instigated, where there is a break from reality that's quite sudden and that is, very rapidly ameliorated with antipsychotic medication, right? There is such a thing as bipolar disorder, where somebody has really discrete episodes where they are extremely high energy and they don't need any sleep, and their mind kind of gets untethered from consequences and, kind of concrete constraints, and they see these kind of grandiose possibilities everywhere. And then those same people have awful, terrible nosedives into depression at other times. And, and it is not for any inherent error in their thinking per se. So I think he's wrong, but he had good points about what was wrong with the other side.
Yep. All right. Still a lot of questions. Richard, as a young mom, how do you counsel founders who want to start both a business and a family? It seems like a massive cognitive load.
It is not just cognitive, but,
Time.
temporal,
Yeah.
financial, every kind of load, emotional. And I know multiple founders who've done it. And I know ones who've thrived at it, partly in ways they might not have thrived if they didn't try to do both, in the sense that, like, children are, they take so much time from out of you, and they're, depleting in many ways, but also more fundamentally, they're really energizing because they're little balls of joy and energy and growth and learning. I'm going to probably tear up if I go on any any further. And it depends so much too on life circumstances. Do they have help, and do they have, parents nearby who they can actually trust to watch the kids? And are they both founders, or is one of them a founder while the other one is mostly home with the kids? And does that work for them both at that stage of their life? There are lots of ways that I've seen, founders make it work, but yeah, it's hard. It's really, really hard.
Andrew says, do you find a lot of STEM thinkers, entrepreneurs are repressed in their anger responses? If so, how do you counsel them about that?
That's interesting. If you had just asked about, like, do I find they're repressed? I would say, yeah, I mean, STEM entrepreneur, partly through the confound that they're mostly men, like they're above average repressed compared to women / people in other fields.
Yep.
But anger in particular, that's interesting, because I would say that I don't think is differentially common in STEM engineer type, tech people, founders, as compared to like fuzzy wuzzy humanities, social science, like psychologists or artists or creatives. Because
Yep.
anger generally is an emotion that tends to be taboo, and that, especially as we're growing up, we're not encouraged to express our, anger, disapproval. Obviously depends on the family we're growing up in and the culture, but I've seen this a lot. This is a common kind of pattern where somebody's really not got a kind of healthy repertoire for assertively expressing anger. And so either they tend to kind of turn it on themselves and repress it, and kind of outwardly express it either, as like self-doubt or as burnout or as frustration, but like that's kind of amorphous, diffuse frustration rather than like, I am so mad at you for repeatedly failing at your commitments and not even seeming to care. So I mean, it's super common, but I would say across the board.
Yep. Rob, thoughts on Irving Goffman and symbolic interaction?
Again, I don't think I have anything really authoritative to say. I'd have to go back and brush up. Sorry.
Cobb says Michael Jordan used disrespect and doubt from others as motivation to work hard. Isn't that a form of secondhandedness?
It's a great question. So yeah, he's a fascinating study in the builder's mindset and in, the psychology of ambition. If you guys haven't seen the documentary, The Last Dance, I highly, highly recommend it.
Really good. Yeah.
So it's a really good question. And I've thought about this. My take on his sort of rage tactics, where he would get really resentful. He would like it. I mean, and he said this himself, that he would invent slights so that he could get himself all riled up for the game. So no, I definitely don't think it's secondhanded in that it's so self-driven. Like he's the one making stuff up in a very strategic way in order to motivate himself and in order to motivate his team. And it's like idiosyncratic to him, the things that would piss him off. So like that this is not coming from any other source or from any, and he doesn't actually care what any of these other people think. It's very much about like, he's going to be the best in the sense that like, he is going to achieve peak greatness as a basketball player. It's not, again, even there, like, I mean, at the point where he was many heads above every other basketball player, clearly he was not satisfied, to just stay at that level of play. Like he wanted to be better. So it can't be secondhanded at that, but right. Like you can kind of really see that he holds his own bar and he has his own standards and his own reasons for playing and for wanting to win. What's really interesting about it is, it seems like this really like negatively motivated competitiveness. Right. And I think it's really hard to know, of course, without, like knowing him and talking to him and having direct access. But from the documentary, from things I've read and heard, I actually think it was net healthy in a weird way where like I might not, like if I were coaching him and if he were soliciting advice on, look, I really need to bring my best at games. I need to get myself into the mindset. It's a fragile mindset. Like it really, the level of like focus and energy and just like relentless, physical, mental exertion that it takes to achieve what he would achieve routinely in games. Like it's superhuman. Like most of us probably have never experienced anything remotely close to that like level of peak performance. And to do it, like it takes fuel and it takes different kinds of fuel for everybody. And this is in the book about just like the kind of the fragile art of fueling and maintaining that kind of motivation to build, motivation, to work, to exert effort towards something really hard. And for him, like what it represented deep down, and how would we know except that he talks about it later and kind of reflects back on like, what was he even doing there? Why was he doing it? And it's a kind of sharpening. It's like a making salient in the moment of like, I want this and I'm going after it and nothing and nobody is going to stop me. Right. So like in a certain way, it's like a hack. It's a gimmick, just like people will like rub their rabbit foot or whatever before, a game or have their little rituals where it's not like they actually think there's some sort of magical property to the rabbit. It's like, this is my cue to myself to get into game mode and to give it all and to leave it all on the floor.
Yep. Interesting.
Yeah. There's more to say about it, but
I'm sure.
Gone on long enough. And it sounds
what
like
valuable insights on psychology of ambition have you learned about regarding ambitious high functioning AUDHD, autism plus
autism,
ADHD?
This is the newest acronym.
Like myself, how about insights that can help people with AUDHD?
So I've written a little bit about at least the ADHD part of that compound. So check out my Substack post from ADHD skeptic to Adderall enthusiast, if you wanted my specific personal, story and take. I guess without having more specifics, obviously, I would say the big failure mode, the big error mode that's just like really ubiquitous right now when it comes to these kinds of diagnostic labels and the kind of the ways that we use them in thinking is that we're pathologizing phenomena that are completely natural and normal to the human experience, that package together, like difficulty maintaining focus and motivation with having really bespoke interests that you take really seriously, that you're really intense about, and that weird people out because you're so intense about them, which look like ASD or is no longer ASD, which look like high functioning autism to people who are on the premise of looking for it, and which can then kind of result in a whole schema, a whole identity that then you kind of like index on, and that ends up becoming in some ways a self-fulfilling prophecy. That doesn't mean that, sure, like there is a real phenomenon of autism, that, there is a spectrum of, like the various kinds of traits, both on the kind of executive functioning side, the ADHD, and like the theory of mind, social, kind of reciprocity side with autism. I would think much less in terms of diagnostic categories and much more in terms of like the actual experience and the actual, like the descriptive concepts for what you as an individual are dealing with, what you're up against, what your challenges are, what you want, what you need, and to just assume that it's healthy and normal until proven otherwise, and treat it as a problem of living, because problems of living are hard enough, and a lot of the same advice turns out to apply.
Good.
And don't hesitate to take medication if it helps you. Believe it or not, that advice goes hand in hand. You don't even need a diagnosis, except legally. Say la vie.
Cobb asks, what do you think of Jonathan Haidt's analysis of psychological differences between liberals and conservatives? Any evidence supporting that analysis?
I straightforwardly hate his analysis. He leverages the kind of evidence that social psychologists leverage for their theories, which is like, you ask people questions on your questionnaire where you've, written questions aligned with your pre-existing theory. And then as long as they sort of loosely cluster into like correlated items, then, you further correlate them with whether people endorse this or that attitude, again, as befitting your theory. And
Yep.
then if you see correlations, then that strengthens your belief in your theory, and never mind whether it replicates. I mean, that's probably like an overly dismissive account of the research, the kind of empirical body of work, although I actually think it's probably fair. I mean, and if we look at the theory on its face, it's a theory of innate moral attitudes, premises that have evolutionary explanations. Like some people, they evolved, like they have a really kind of overdeveloped sense of like harm avoidance because, of course, when we were in the cave, like we needed to keep bad stuff from happening to us. Some people, they have this really overdeveloped sense of like in-group cohesion because, they needed to like keep close to their tribe to keep away the other tribes, because otherwise, they would get killed by the other tribe. And some people, and like, that's why some people believe that, we should have capitalism, and why some people believe that we should be communists, and so on and so forth. Like, I mean, judge it on its merits, correlations aside. Anyway.
Pabos asks, how should one deal with irrational urges? Is resisting them through sheer willpower the right approach?
Rarely. At least certainly rarely in a sustained way as a long-term strategy. I mean, in moments, it might be if you kind of have a context that you've already established for yourself of like, this is a habit. I know where it comes from. It doesn't serve me in these contexts. I'm trying to break it. And so like absent some better strategy that's, like going to kind of last me longer, that's not going to deplete me, I'm just going to power through. But I know I only have to do this for 10 minutes, or I know that tomorrow I'm going to be out of harm's way or out of temptations, like I'm not going to be going to these parties with, where everybody's drinking, except for this one time that I really needed to land a customer. And so I'm just, like, I don't have time to come up with a strategy where I'm like holding a glass of water and, fulfilling my need in other ways. And so I'm just going to have to try to like brute force it. But it's, brute forcing it just means like we've, for whatever reason, been unable to fully capture the context of knowledge for ourselves in an emotionally embodied way for why we don't want to do this. Right. So like optimal, like ideally you want to be able to capture it whenever you can, because it's, that it's better for you. Yeah. Guess that's
Cobb, is it true that psychologists still have no idea how sexual orientation is formed?
Yes, that is indeed the case. Last I checked.
Okay.
Unless
but Gena's going to work on this.
studies.
Maybe it's the next project.
Will I? that's a big ask. But
sex, more generally sex. That's what you said.
I will look into it as a matter of personal education, not promising that I'm going to be writing the next book on it. But who knows? Life is long, as Matt likes to say.
It is long. Well, it's long from where you are. It's a lot shorter from where I am.
Well, I mean, with life extension research being what it is, you'll outlive us all.
Well, okay, maybe. Let's see. If one has a crush on someone while in a committed relationship, how can one eliminate that attraction?
Interesting.
Eliminate it.
Yeah, I noticed that
Sounds
too.
pretty,
yeah, I mean, I would first just back up a step, and just first ask, like, what's happening here?
Yep.
And what do I want here? And what does this mean for the relationship? What does it mean? Like, why, is this a problem even? How is this a problem?
Yep.
Is it a symptom of something that's not quite working in the relationship? Should we talk it through? Like, is this something to kind of, share with my partner? Is this something that this is just like a superficial passing thing, in which case, like, just kind of letting it pass might be the, most efficient solution. It really just depends. So I wouldn't assume that like you have a job of elimination to do. I would,
I agree.
Introspect and be curious.
Monotropic. What do you think of the argument from Daniel G. Amen that mental illness are largely caused by disorders in the brain? So
like the anti-SAS perspective, basically.
It seems like the flip side of SAS. Yeah.
I think it's also wrong. I think they're both wrong. And I think, the truth is much more mind-body integrated, and neither reduction, neither attempting to reduce psychological phenomena to mind nor to body are going to cut it. Yep. Because, we are integrated organisms.
Sakab says, I struggle to function without caffeine. As a common problem.
Join the club.
And it makes me feel like a fraud, as if my caffeinated self isn't my true self. Is that irrational?
Well, do you feel that way about food? So like if you don't eat for, 3 days or a week, or if you don't drink, or if you don't sleep, like you probably become a really dysfunctional zombie at some point. So like, does that mean it's not the real you when you do get sleep or when you do eat food? Like, caffeine, though stigmatized in some circles, is another, it's a resource that we imbibe in order to get certain needs met. And sometimes we might over rely on it relative to whatever costs it might have. Like if we get terrible headaches when we don't have access to caffeine, or, if we end up with withdrawals that are really painful, or, or throw us off kilter, or, or if there are like cardiac effects, God forbid, if you're like really guzzling gallons of coffee. But in and of itself, it's a resource like the many others that we use in order to function at our peak and to be our full selves. So I would definitely not feel ashamed of it.
Cobb says, if humans were largely tabula rasa, would men and women be far more similar in a fully rational society?
I would have to clarify what we mean by fully tabula rasa, like as opposed to what? As opposed to what we are?
Yeah.
So like, I don't know if you is like in the sense that Rand meant that, we don't have innate knowledge or innate ideas. Obviously, we have a lot of other stuff that's innate. We have a temperament. We have, we
I
have
think
an
the
eye
question
color
is,
and
are
height.
men and women innately different?
I see.
I think that's
In some ways,
ultimately.
yes. And, in the important ways for most of the debates around this topic, no. But like with respect to their sexual physiology and psychology, yes.
Yeah.
That's the main, like, that's what I say. And,
Well, and that
there's
has to have some psychological manifestation, mind
I
body.
don't think like in this specific case, I don't think like has to in some like metaphysical or deterministic sense. Like it's an empirical question. What does this particular biological difference, entail? And I think, it's really, so just to be fair, I think there are all sorts of things we actually just don't know how to parse between culture and, innate sex difference. And so I don't know the answer as far, like if we control away culture, which maybe is the real kind of question being asked here, is like completely, controlling for all the ideas floating in the kind of mores, the norms, implicit kind of schemas floating around about kind of gender roles and how we're supposed to differ, like what would be left of those differences. And I actually just don't think we know. But I do think that, we know some things with more confidence than other things, but we don't know anything with perfect confidence because we haven't been able to run that experiment. We know cross-culturally certain things remain and certain things vary as a function of culture. We know like in more gender egalitarian countries, you actually end up with less gender diversity in certain specific fields, like nursing and I don't know, like computer science, something like that, but don't quote me on that. So like, why do, we know boys will play with trucks no matter how much their parents like refuse to use gender pronouns or have any gender talk at all. And we know girls will play with dolls and want to be princesses. So like there are clearly certain innate things, but we don't know how far they go sans culture.
No. All right. This is Neil. What are some other signs of ADHD other than not being able to focus? I never had a hard time with sitting at a desk for long periods of time, but learning has been a struggle both at home and at work.
So the question is, what are the symptoms apart from,
Not being able to focus.
Not being able to focus. So it's highly variable what particular mix of symptoms. You have to have 6 out of 9 of either of 2 sets of symptoms, inattentive or hyperactive, in order to get a diagnosis of ADHD. And I mean, you could literally just look them up online. Just like, what are the 9 of each? For the very literal answer to that question, it's super easy to just like ADHD, DSM symptoms or DSM criteria. But it's, on the inattentive side, I'm trying to think, like, is it actually more useful for this question for me to rattle off symptoms, or more useful maybe to address the meta level question, which is,
I think the meta level question.
This is not a natural kind.
Yeah.
This is a cluster of characteristics, behaviors, kind of faculties that people tend to differ on, but like on a smooth continuum. There's no sharp cutoff where like, now there's this set of people who like have all of these problems, and then there's everyone else over here. Like it's a smooth distribution. And I would again think less in terms of, am I disordered, and more in terms of like, what is hard for me and why is it hard for me and how do I get what I need? And maybe, and by the way, psychostimulant medication works for everyone, regardless of whether they're diagnosed with ADHD.
Interesting.
So, but I could go into that more.
Yeah.
Okay, how many more questions? Do they just keep coming, or?
No, I've stopped them. So,
okay.
So
this is the right
1, 2, 3, 5. 5 more questions.
Gotta say goodnight to my kids. So at the end of these 5.
Yeah. Okay. So does the phrase "listen to your heart" have a serious role in introspection? I interpret the phrase as focus your brain on your body's feelings.
I mean, I think it's a metaphorical, turn of phrase. So it really just depends on how you're interpreting it and
Yeah.
what,
Yeah.
like what it connotes to you. And that seems like a fine connotation, and that seems like a useful thing to sometimes do. So it's just, I don't think it's that precise, as a prescription, but if it's sort of poetically useful, then by all means.
hmm Carl says 3 cheers to psychology based on an objectivist philosophy base.
3
Cool.
cheers.
Yeah.
Cool. 3 cheers.
Okay. Kim's got an idea for a new book. I'm kidding, but the question is a new book. Tips for raising kids well.
That is a new book. All
Yeah.
right.
I'm not
Matt's
sure that.
working on that book. So
Oh,
I
he
can't just
is.
defer
There
to
you
him. I
go.
mean, not
Okay.
exact. That's not the exact literal,
Yeah.
it's a book on agency and education. So the new
Yep.
normal, he calls it, but it will have many such tips.
Good.
So yeah, I wouldn't even know where to start, but
Yep.
happy
Too
to.
big of a question.
Yeah.
Steve-O says, what is the effect of sleep deprivation? Is it like being drunk or worse? My mother says she worked for years on hardly any sleep. What do you make of that?
I mean, I would ask what she means by hardly any. So like if you
Yeah.
get, if you're sleep deprived, I don't remember if I think it's like 48 hours, you start to hallucinate pretty reliably. If you actually aren't sleeping at all. If you're sleeping like fewer hours than you would need in order to get at least one really good, solid, like deep sleep, REM cycle, then you're going to have all sorts of crazy cognitive deficits. You're going to have, trouble. You're going to look like you have all sorts of diagnoses at that point, and I mean, there's also just going to be individual differences in like, do you, well, is it like you're drunk? Well, what are you like drunk? Because some
Yeah.
people are violent drunks and some people are pleasant, sleepy drunks, same with sleep deprivation, but that it has pretty severe effects if you, really if you go to the extremes, that is for sure. But also, yeah, people are highly like, there are people who actually just function on relatively less sleep than other people, but, within a certain
Yeah.
band, a certain, range. If I don't know anybody who could function, and I don't think that science would suggest like you're not going to be able to
Not
do less than
consistently,
4
no.
hours consistently. But
I
like
think
some people,
I've done 48 hours or over 48 hours. The only thing I would suggest is don't drive.
yes, please God, don't
I
drive
found
on
myself
48 hours without sleep.
on
Please
yeah,
don't.
not a
So
good
yeah.
not a good
Ugh.
outcome. Yeah.
Ugh.
I survived, but it was by luck, not by any virtue.
I'm really glad you're on. I'm glad that you're here with
I
us
was young.
today.
I couldn't do 48 hours anywhere close to 48 hours today.
Well,
But yes, I think adrenaline, if you're working straight, if you're engaged in an activity and you're really working hard and you can go for a while, but then you collapse
and you need to catch up, and
you
you have
need to
sleep
catch up. You
debt,
need to make
and
it
you're
up.
just not gonna. Yeah, it comes back.
Right.
There are no free lunches, and there are no
No.
really all-nighters.
Yeah, we've all done all-nighters. Yeah, so it's
Sure,
it's doable, but you
it's
you have to
totally.
make it up
But
ultimately.
but you just got to pay it back. Take
Okay.
what you want and then pay
Talk
for
about sleepless. As a new parent,
it.
sad
Yes.
stories about children make me project onto my own children and feel deeply saddened. Is that healthy or necessary?
Aw, sad stories about other children. Just to make sure I heard
Yeah,
right.
about other children. Yeah,
I
I get
mean,
that.
I get it, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm with you. Whether or not it's necessary or healthy, I get it.
Yeah.
It's hard to not do or feel. I mean, to some degree, like, yeah, naturally, it would be weird if you didn't feel any
Yeah.
feelings,
Yeah.
if it's like a really vivid, story that you can easily imagine, like happening with I mean, so I think like within some range, I would say, yeah, it's completely healthy and unavoidable and
Mhm.
probably reflects, like that you have a well-functioning emotional apparatus and you love your kids.
Yep.
Past a certain range, to the extent that it becomes all consuming, to the extent that it starts intruding upon. So a very common postpartum mental health challenge is actually postpartum OCD. where you get intrusive thoughts. This also happens in pregnancy, but it's even more common postpartum, where, even if you never had it before, or if you're just like a little bit low-key anxiety prone, it can just really, really flare up postpartum, where you've got constant intrusive thoughts of like harming your baby or something bad happening to your baby, or, being molesting your baby. And there's all kinds of just horrible, awful thoughts that feel like, oh my gosh, like if I'm thinking these things, maybe I'll do them, or this makes me a bad mom. All of that is wrong. All of that is treatable, and nothing is bad or wrong about you if you're having thoughts like that, other than just that they're distressing, and they can be brought under control, whether with some formal therapy or even sometimes by just kind of realizing that that's what they are and that it's normal and okay, and not indulging them, not kind of letting them, not feeding those narratives. Anyways.
All right, last question. Carl asked for thoughts about Steven Pinker at Ocon.
Thoughts? It's really cool. I'm excited to see him. I don't know. I'm not sure what more specific thoughts I could have at this stage. I don't know what the panel is going to be, or who's going to be on it.
No idea.
I'm excited to see him. I did I've actually done a public conversation with him before, a salon on his rationality book that you can all find on YouTube if you want. Just go, put in both our names or rationality, yada yada. And he was really fun to talk ideas.
Yeah, seems like a fun guy to talk to.
Yeah, I think it was going to be great. Hopefully,
I'm looking forward to it.
Get to catch up with him.
Good. Well, thank you.
Whew.
2+ hours. All right. Good job.
That was fun, as always. Good. Thank you so much.
Glad
for
you enjoyed
me,
it.
Yaron.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for the thought-provoking questions.
All right. And I'm sure we could go on for many more hours.
No doubt. But sleep awaits first.
Sleep definitely awaits. I'm 2 hours ahead of you.
Oh, yeah.
And
let you go to sleep. Speaking of.
Maybe I'll see you in Austin soon. Maybe.
I will be counting on it.
Good.
And then New Orleans after that.
There you go.
All right.
Thanks, Gena.
Thank you.
Bye.